Kira had not always been a warrior. In the time before the Coalition came, she had spent her days tending to the great crystal forests of Elenthor. These were not ordinary trees. They grew from the very heart of the planet itself, their branches reaching toward the sky in impossible spirals that caught sunlight and transformed it into something more, something magical. The elves had protected these forests for 10,000 years. They had never needed to do anything else. The forest provided everything they required. Food grew from the ground. Water flowed from the springs. Medicine came from the flowers. There was no hunger. There was no disease. There was no need for change. Kira had been content in those days. She remembered the feeling of the bark beneath her fingers as she walked through the groves at dawn. She remembered the songs of the ancient birds that nested in the highest branches. She remembered the peace that came from knowing that tomorrow would be exactly like today, and the day after that would match them both. It was a good life. It was a safe life. It was a life without fear. Then came the day when the sky turned black. She had been in the southern groves when the invasion fleet appeared. The sensors had triggered first, a high-pitched alarm that the elves had never heard in their entire existence. The alarms were old technology, built by their ancestors 10,000 years ago as a precaution against a threat that never came. No one truly believed they would ever be needed, but the sensors screamed that day, and everyone stopped what they were doing. Kira climbed to the top of the highest crystal tree. From there, she could see across the entire continent. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the endless blue sky and the soft glow of the sun reflecting off the crystal forest below. Then she looked higher, above the clouds, above the atmosphere itself. The ships descended like locusts. They were not beautiful. Elven ships had always been graceful things, curved and organic, as if grown rather than built. These ships were geometric and harsh. They were weapons disguised as vehicles. Kira counted them as they came, 10, 50, 200. The numbers became meaningless after a while. There were enough ships to blot out the sun. She climbed down quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. The ancient alarms continued to scream. By the time she reached the forest floor, the first explosions were already beginning. The great crystal trees, which had stood for thousands of years, began to break. Kira watched in horror as the very foundation of her world started to crumble. She ran toward the nearest settlement, a place called Silverwind where thousands of elves lived in harmony with nature. She arrived to find it already under attack. The Coalition forces did not hesitate. They did not ask for surrender or offer peace. They simply destroyed. Kira saw things that day that changed her forever. She saw homes that had sheltered elves for centuries burn like paper. She saw the elders who had taught her about the old ways fall to weapons that made no sound and left no mark except death. She saw children who had never known fear experience it all at once before they died. The elven military fought back with everything they had. Their mages threw spells that created walls of pure magic. Their warriors swung swords that had been forged in the first age of the world. Their archers fired arrows that never missed. And still they were losing. The Coalition did not fight with magic or ancient wisdom. The Coalition fought with tactics and numbers and weapons that did not care about honor or tradition. They simply overwhelmed through sheer force of will and superior technology. Kira grabbed a bow, something she had been trained to use in the days when hunting was done for sport rather than survival. She had never used it to kill a human. The Coalition soldiers were human, she realized with shock. They were tall and varied in appearance, with skin of many colors and eyes that showed no mercy. They wore armor that seemed to absorb light. They carried weapons that she did not understand. And they kept coming, wave after wave after wave. She fired her arrow at the nearest soldier. It struck true, finding a gap in his armor between his shoulder and neck. He fell. Kira felt something crack inside her then. She had taken a life. She had never done such a thing before, even though she was 2,000 years old. That moment marked the end of her innocence. It marked the beginning of her as something else. Something harder, something that could survive. For 3 days, the elves fought. The Coalition pushed forward, burning and destroying everything in their path. The great crystal forest began to fall. Entire regions of Elanthor transformed from paradise into wasteland. Kira fought from place to place, never staying still for long. Always running, always firing arrows, always watching people she loved vanish into smoke and light and violence. She began to understand why humans built weapons and studied strategy. She began to understand that sometimes peace could be destroyed by those who did not value it. On the fourth day, hope came from an unexpected direction. A ship descended through the chaos of the invasion, and this ship was different from the Coalition destroyers. It was smaller and faster, and it was not gray like the others. It was white and blue, and it bore symbols that Kira had never seen before. The ship's weapons opened fire on the Coalition forces, and suddenly, the overwhelming tide began to turn. The ship continued to descend until it landed in the ruins of Silverwind. From it emerged a human who would change everything. Commander Marcus Wells was not tall for a human. He was not the biggest or the strongest, but he carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who believed that impossible was just another word that humans had not learned yet. He had dark hair and sharp eyes and a scar across his left cheek that looked like it came from another war, another time, another conflict. Behind him came soldiers in white armor. They moved with precision and purpose. They did not move like the Coalition soldiers. These humans moved with discipline and training. They had studied the terrain. They had analyzed the weaknesses in the Coalition formation. Within hours of their arrival, the tide had turned completely. The Coalition forces, which had seemed overwhelming just moments before, found themselves being pushed back. Kira watched from a distance as Commander Wells coordinated his forces. She was fascinated by how he thought. He did not rely on magic. He did not appeal to ancient wisdom. He simply calculated probabilities and moved his forces to create the highest chance of victory. He understood that killing the enemy was important, but damaging their supply lines was more important. He understood that a show of force sometimes saved more lives than actually using force. He understood strategy in a way that was completely foreign to elven thinking, but absolutely sensible once you saw it. When the first wave of Coalition troops tried to push back against the human defenders, Commander Wells was waiting. He had positioned his people not where they would meet the Coalition head-on, but in a location that would allow him to strike their flank. The human soldiers fired in coordinated waves, each moment planned and perfect. The Coalition, used to overwhelming their enemies through numbers alone, found themselves disrupted and confused. On the fifth day, the Coalition fleet retreated. Their ships rose back into space, their mission to conquer Elanthor a complete failure, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Half of the continent was destroyed. Millions of elves had died. The great crystal forests, which had grown for millennia, were reduced to smoking rubble. The world that Kira had known was gone forever. She approached Commander Wells when the fighting stopped. Around them, the survivors were beginning to emerge from their hiding places. The human officer was directing his people to begin medical operations and to set up safe zones for the injured. "Why did you come?" she asked him. "Your world is far away. Your people have their own problems. Why risk your life for strangers?" Commander Wells looked at her with eyes that had seen too much loss and too much suffering. He smiled anyway. He said, "Because the Coalition destroys everything. If we do not stop them here, they will grow stronger. They will keep expanding until they reach human space. And because I received a message from a dying alien diplomat 3 years ago, who told me that the most important thing we could do was build alliances. He told me that no single species could survive what was coming. We had to learn to work together or we would all fall. I came because it is the right thing to do. And because humans have survived worse, we will help you rebuild." That moment, standing in the ruins of her world, looking at a human who had risked everything for her people, Kira understood that her old life was truly over. A new one was about to begin. A life where she would learn to think like humans. A life where she would learn that strength came not just from the past, but from the willingness to embrace the future. The first weeks after the invasion were the hardest for Kira. The settlement that had been rebuilt around Commander Wells's temporary base was a place of chaos and sorrow. Thousands of elves wandered through the streets in a daze, unable to comprehend the destruction of everything they had known. The ancient songs that had always guided elven life seemed hollow now. The old traditions that had sustained their civilization for 10,000 years felt meaningless in the face of practical survival. Commander Wells began teaching immediately. He gathered the elven leaders and showed them things that their ancestors had never imagined. He had advanced medical technology that could heal wounds that would have meant death in the old days. He had weapons that could be produced quickly and distributed to fighters who had never held anything but tools or ceremonial items. He had strategies and tactics that turned chaos into order. Most importantly, he had hope. He believed that they could survive this. He believed that they could adapt and rebuild and become something stronger. Kira volunteered to be among the first to train with the human soldiers. The other elves thought she was strange. They questioned why anyone would choose to take up the aggressive stance of human warriors when they could return to the peaceful ways of their ancestors. But Kira had seen something in the invasion that they had not fully processed. She had seen that peace without the ability to defend it was just slow death. She had seen that the old ways could not protect them from the new threats of the galaxy. Commander Wells accepted her immediately. He recognized something in her that reminded him of the best human soldiers he had known: a willingness to learn, a willingness to change, a willingness to understand that survival sometimes meant becoming something different than what you had been before. The training was brutal. Kira had always thought of herself as fit and strong. Elves had incredible endurance and grace. They could move through forests for days without tiring. But human training was different. It was designed not just for survival, but for killing efficiency. Commander Wells taught her about tactics and probability. He taught her to think about 3 steps ahead instead of just reacting to what was in front of her. One day, during a training exercise, she failed to anticipate an ambush. A human soldier moved faster than she expected and struck her down. She fell hard, her body aching. Commander Wells helped her up immediately, but his expression showed no pity. "You were thinking like a hunter in an old forest," he said. "You were looking for prey. In real combat, you need to assume that everything is a trap. You need to question everything. You need to be faster and smarter and more willing to do terrible things than your enemy. That is how humans survive. That is how we conquered our own world. That is how we will help you reconquer yours." Kira's arms were shaking from the exertion, but she stood again. She asked him to teach her more. She asked him to teach her to think like a human. She asked him to teach her to fight not with ancient magic, but with modern tactics and strategy. Weeks passed. Kira trained every day. She studied human history. She learned about wars that had destroyed human civilizations. She learned about human perseverance. She learned that humans had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times, but they had always found a way to survive and rebuild. It was in their nature. They did not accept defeat. They did not believe in inevitable outcomes. They simply refused to lose. She began to change. Her movements became sharper and more efficient. Her thinking became faster and more adaptive. She started to see situations not as they were, but as they could be. She started to understand that rules were suggestions and obstacles were puzzles to be solved. She was becoming something new, something that was no longer purely elven but not quite human either. During this time, the Kalians arrived. The Kalians were a species that the elves had known about but never met. They were from a system 3 jumps away from Alanthor. They were reptilian in appearance, with scales and tails and sharp intelligence in their golden eyes. They had come because they too had been attacked by the Coalition. They had lost entire cities. They had decided to join with the humans and elves to form a united resistance. With the Kalians came weapons technology that was superior even to human technology. With them came strategic knowledge that had been earned through wars that had lasted centuries. With them came the understanding that if smaller species did not cooperate, the Coalition would continue to destroy them one world at a time. Commander Wells brought Kira into a strategy meeting with the Kalian commanders. She was nervous. The Kalians were intimidating. They were 7 feet tall and carried themselves with ancient authority. But their leader, a female named Thren, looked at Kira with respect. Thren had also been a warrior in the old ways before the Coalition came. Thren had also been forced to become something else. "You have learned much from Commander Wells," Thren said to her in a language that Kira understood perfectly through some kind of translation device. "But there is a difference between learning human tactics and understanding how to combine them with your own nature. You are still too rigid, too committed to the decisions you make. The best warriors are like water. They flow around obstacles. They adapt. They change. A human warrior will decide on a plan and commit to it. A Kalian warrior will commit to victory but be flexible about how they achieve it. You must learn to be both." Kira bowed, showing respect to the ancient warrior. Over the next weeks, Thren taught her in addition to Commander Wells. She learned that her elven heritage was not a weakness. Her speed and grace and connection to magic were powerful things, but they needed to be combined with human willingness to adapt and Kalian understanding of subtlety. She needed to learn to think in multiple ways simultaneously. The 3 species began to work together more closely. They set up joint defense stations across Elanthor. They began to rebuild the infrastructure that had been destroyed. They began to plan not just for survival, but for counterattack. The plan was ambitious. They would not just defend their own worlds. They would strike back at the Coalition. They would find their facilities and their bases and their supply lines. They would cripple them. For this plan to work, they needed something extraordinary. They needed warriors who could think like multiple species, warriors who could adapt and change and improvise, warriors who understood the strengths and weaknesses of all three civilizations. Kira became one of these warriors. Over the course of 6 months, she transformed from a peaceful elf ranger into something completely different. She was a soldier now, a strategist, a hybrid warrior who could combine the ancient knowledge of the elves with the practical innovation of humans and the calculated subtlety of the Kallians. It was during this time that she first encountered the dragon eggs. Coalition base had been attacked in a joint human-elven operation. The base was small but contained something unusual. In a deep chamber beneath the structure, they found 3 eggs, each the size of a human child. They glowed with bioluminescent light. The Coalition scientists had been breeding dragons as weapons, genetic experiments designed to create the perfect weapon of destruction. But something had gone wrong in the breeding. The dragons that should have emerged would have been mindless and violent. Instead, the eggs still contained creatures of pure potential. Commander Wells wanted to destroy them. They were weapons. They could not be trusted, but Kira asked for a chance to try something different. She asked to take the eggs. She asked to care for them, and see if she could nurture something other than weapons. Commander Wells looked at her for a long moment. Then he agreed. He said, "You are learning what it means to be human. Humans take risks on things that seem impossible. We believe in potential. We believe in change. Take the eggs. Raise them, and if they become our enemies, I will destroy them myself." Kira took that responsibility seriously. She set up a chamber where the eggs could incubate. She combined human technology with elven magic and Kalian biology knowledge. She created the perfect environment for new life. And she waited. She waited and hoped and believed that something good could come from something that had been created as a weapon. The eggs began to show signs of hatching on the 147th day. Kira had been monitoring them constantly, checking the temperature readings and the bioluminescent patterns every few hours. She had named the chamber the hatchery, and it had become the most important place in her life. The rest of the world continued around her. The Human-Elf-Kalian alliance continued to grow stronger. Joint bases were established across 3 different planetary systems. Defense networks were constructed and tested. Military campaigns were planned against coalition positions, but Kira focused on the eggs. She would sit in the chamber and speak to them. She would tell them stories of the ancient elven forests. She would sing the old songs that had guided her people for 10,000 years. She would also tell them about humans. She would describe humanity's remarkable journey from a single planet to the stars. She would tell them about human courage and human stubbornness and human ability to create beauty in the midst of destruction. Commander Wells would sometimes come to watch her work. He would stand in the doorway of the hatchery and observe as she tended to the eggs with such careful attention. He said very little, but his presence was comforting. Kira understood that he was curious about her choice to care for these things that had been created as weapons. He was curious about whether she was right to believe that they could become something else. One morning, Kira noticed that the first egg was beginning to crack. The bioluminescent glow inside had changed color. It was no longer a pale blue. Now it was a deep purple with hints of red around the edges. She called for Commander Wells and Thren. She felt that they should be present for this moment. What had begun as a weapon might be becoming something entirely new. The egg split open over the course of several hours. The process was slow and deliberate. Inside the shell, something moved with purpose and intelligence. A snout emerged first. It was covered in scales that caught the light and reflected it back in shimmering waves. Then came eyes, large and golden and filled with awareness and curiosity. Then came the rest of the creature. Cypher was the name that came to Kira's mind when she saw the first dragon emerge. He was magnificent. His scales were deep blue with silver markings along his spine. His wings were delicate despite their size, like the wings of an enormous butterfly. He took his first breath and made a sound that was not a roar or a hiss, but something gentler, something like the call of a musical instrument. Kira approached slowly. The dragon's eyes tracked her movement. She could feel intelligence behind those eyes. Not the mindless hunger that a coalition weapon would have. This was something different. This was awareness and recognition and something that looked almost like gratitude. She reached out her hand and the dragon moved his head forward. His scales were warm and smooth beneath her fingers. A connection formed in that moment. It was not something she could explain in words. It was something deeper than words. The dragon had just entered the world and already he had chosen Kira as his mother. He had chosen her as the person who would guide him and protect him, and show him what it meant to live. Within an hour, the second egg began to crack. This dragon emerged with more vigor than the first. She was bright red with gold markings. She moved with explosive energy. When she saw Kira and Cypher together, she made her decision immediately. She waddled over on uncertain legs and pressed herself against them both. Blaze was her name. She was smaller than Cypher but possessed twice the energy and appetite. The third egg took longer. Everyone waited patiently. Commander Wells brought food for Kira to eat. Thren brought water to drink. The other humans and elves who had come to observe stood in respectful silence. The hatching of these dragons felt important. It felt like it meant something for the future. When the third egg finally split, the dragon that emerged was different from the other two. Storm, as Kira immediately named her, had scales of deep gray blue with patterns that looked like lightning frozen in time. She was the smallest of the three, but had an intensity about her that was almost frightening. Her eyes were not golden like the others. They were silver. When she looked at Kira, it was with an expression of absolute determination. All three dragons recognized Kira instantly. Despite being newborns, they gravitated toward her. She spent the entire first night simply holding them, one in her lap and the other two curled up against her side. She provided warmth and comfort and love. In return, they provided their absolute loyalty. Over the next few weeks, Kira taught the dragons. She trained them the way she had trained herself. She combined elven understanding of magic with human practical knowledge and Kalian subtle strategy. The dragons proved to be quick learners. They grew at an accelerated rate, their bodies expanding rapidly as they consumed enormous quantities of food. Cypher became fascinated by strategy. He would watch recordings of human battles, his eyes tracking every movement, every tactical decision. He asked questions, using a form of mental communication that Kira gradually learned to understand. He wanted to know why certain decisions were made. He wanted to understand the logic behind human tactics. Blaze was interested in everything at once. She wanted to learn to fly and to fight and to understand the different species that now lived in the Alliance. She had a friendly nature, and quickly became a favorite among the soldiers who came to observe the dragons. She would play with them, teaching them to tumble and roll and move with more grace than they had been capable of before training. Storm was focused, always focused. She wanted to understand weapons. She wanted to understand the coalition. She wanted to know their weaknesses and their strengths. Unlike her siblings, she did not play much. She studied. She learned. She prepared. It became clear to everyone watching that these dragons were not weapons of destruction. They were something entirely new. They were the proof of what could happen when different species worked together to create something. They were symbols of hope. They were the embodiment of what the Alliance was trying to achieve. When the dragons were 3 months old, Kira took them to meet Commander Wells formally. They had seen him before, of course, but this was different. This was a recognition that they had grown beyond the hatchery. This was an acknowledgement that they were part of the wider Alliance. Commander Wells stood in the center of a large training ground. The 3 dragons approached him slowly. Cypher moved with deliberate grace. Blaze bounced with enthusiasm. Storm stalked with predatory focus. When they reached him, each dragon did something remarkable. They bowed. Not the way animals bowed. The way warriors bowed to acknowledge a commander whom they respected. Commander Wells smiled. It was a smile of profound satisfaction. He reached out and placed his hand on Cypher's snout. He said, "Welcome to the Alliance. Welcome to this new world that we are building together. I believe you will have a role to play in what comes next. I believe you will help us create something that has never existed before." Kira understood then what was happening. The dragons were no longer just her personal responsibility. They were becoming part of something larger. They were becoming soldiers in an alliance. They were becoming participants in a war that would determine the future of the galaxy itself. She was proud of them, but she was also afraid. because she knew that soon she would have to teach them not just how to fight, but how to prepare for death. She would have to teach them that being a warrior meant accepting that sacrifice was sometimes necessary. That night, she held them all close one more time before the world would demand more of them. She held them and hoped that when the time came, they would have the strength to do what needed to be done. By the time the dragons reached their first year of life, they had grown to remarkable proportions. Cypher was the size of a large airship. Blaze was slightly smaller but with a more agile frame. Storm was the smallest but had developed the most powerful bite force that any of the human scientists had ever measured. The three dragons represented something unprecedented. They were weapons, yes, but they were also intelligent beings. They were individuals with personalities and preferences and dreams of their own. Kira had begun to think of them as her children, though she knew that was complicated. They were her responsibility. They were her charges, but they were also independent beings capable of making their own decisions. She struggled with this duality every day. She wanted to protect them from harm, but she also understood that they had a role to play in the coming conflict. The coalition had not been idle. Intelligence reports indicated that they were amassing forces for another invasion attempt. This time they were targeting the human homeworld directly. The message was clear. They would not rest until every species that opposed them had been destroyed. The Alliance had to prepare. The Alliance had to be ready to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Commander Wells called a strategy meeting with Kira, Thren, and the leaders of the three allied species. He presented a plan that was radical and dangerous. They would not wait for the coalition to attack them. They would attack first. They would strike at coalition supply lines and forward bases. They would weaken them before the assault on human space. But the plan required something that they had never attempted before. It required pilots who could operate advanced fighter craft while simultaneously using weapons that were powered by magic. Cypher, Blaze, and Storm could do this. They possessed the magical sensitivity of elves combined with the tactical thinking of humans and the biological adaptation abilities of Kalians. They could link with human technology and enhance it. They could think in ways that pure humans or pure elves could not. They were perfect for the mission, but it meant that they would have to leave Kira. It meant that they would have to go into combat. It meant that one or all of them might not return. Kira was silent when she heard the plan. She did not argue. She did not plead to keep her dragons with her. She understood the necessity. She understood that individual happiness sometimes had to be sacrificed for the greater good. She had learned that lesson from humans. She had learned that this was how survival worked. You did what needed to be done, even when it hurt. She spent the next weeks training her dragons for combat in ways that she had never trained them before. She taught them aerial tactics. She taught them how to integrate with human weapons systems. She taught them how to think under pressure. She taught them how to accept orders from commanders who were not her. Most importantly, she taught them that failure was not acceptable, that they had to succeed because failure meant death not just for them, but for millions of innocent beings across multiple worlds. Cypher responded to this training with focused determination. He began to understand tactics on a deeper level. He would watch recording after recording of coalition fighter tactics. He would analyze patterns and weak points. He would develop countermeasures. His strategic thinking was exceptional. He thought in 3 dimensions and 4 temporal steps ahead. When pilots trained with him, they found that he anticipated their moves before they made them. Blaze approached the training differently. She wanted to master speed and agility. She wanted to be faster than anything the coalition could throw at her. She trained relentlessly, pushing her body to its limits and then pushing further. She did acrobatics that seemed impossible for a creature her size. She learned to bank and spin and dive with precision that matched experienced human fighter pilots. Storm was the most frightening to train. She wanted to learn destruction. She wanted to understand the most devastating ways to eliminate enemies. She learned to coordinate her magical abilities with weapon systems. She learned to calculate trajectory and impact. She learned to be an instrument of lethal precision. When she looked at Kira during training, Kira could see something in her eyes that was both terrifying and magnificent. Storm had been born as a weapon, but she had chosen to be more. She had chosen to be a warrior who would decide when and how to use her power. The day came when they had to depart. Kira walked with her 3 dragons to the hangar where the strike fighters awaited. The ships had been modified to accommodate them. Each dragon would pilot a fighter that had been enhanced with magic reactive systems. They would fly together as a formation. They would strike together. They would survive together, or they would fall together. Before they entered the ships, Kira held each of them one last time. She pressed her forehead against Cypher's and felt his calm determination. She touched Blaze's snout and felt her boundless energy and hope. She locked eyes with Storm and saw her absolute commitment to victory. Kira spoke to them without words, using the mental connection they had developed. She said, "I am proud of you. I am terrified for you. I love you. And I believe in you completely. You were created as weapons of destruction, but you have become something so much more. You have become warriors. You have become protectors. You have become my dragons. Go now and show the galaxy what you can do. Come back to me." The dragons approached their fighters. They moved with purpose but without hesitation. Cypher moved with the grace of an ancient warrior entering his final battle. Blaze bounded into her cockpit with enthusiasm, ready for whatever challenges awaited. Storm entered her craft with the focus of an assassin approaching her target. The three fighters lifted off in perfect synchronization. They rose through the atmosphere and toward the stars. Kira watched them go, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. This was what it meant to be a parent in a time of war. This was what it meant to love something so much that you could let it go to face dangers you could not fully protect them from. Commander Wells came to stand beside her. He had lost soldiers before. He knew what she was feeling. "They will return," he said. "They are strong. They are trained. They are not alone. And they have something that most warriors do not have. They have someone who believes in them absolutely. That belief is more powerful than any weapon." Kira did not answer. She simply watched as the three dragons disappeared into the vast darkness of space. Somewhere out there, a coalition fleet was waiting. Somewhere out there, battles would be fought and blood would be spilled. And somewhere out there, her three magnificent dragons would prove what was possible when the galaxy's species came together. Over the next days, reports came in. The strike against the coalition forward base had been successful. Massive damage had been inflicted on their infrastructure. The three dragon pilots had worked in perfect coordination. Cypher's tactical thinking had anticipated every coalition response. Blaze's speed and agility had prevented the enemy from landing a single significant hit. Storm's destructive capabilities had been devastating and precise. Casualties were light. The mission was a complete success. But more importantly, something deeper had been proven. The three dragons had shown the entire alliance what was possible. They had proven that hybrid thinking could overcome traditional military doctrine. They had proven that what had seemed impossible could be achieved through cooperation and training and belief. But the war was far from over. The coalition still had reserves. The coalition still had plans. And somewhere, they were preparing for the next phase of their assault. The alliance knew this. They knew that they had won a battle, but not the war. Kira knew that her dragons would be called upon again. She knew that each time they flew into danger, there was a chance they might not return. She held that knowledge close and continued to train. She continued to prepare, because if her dragons were going to face the darkness, then she would make absolutely certain they were ready. The final battle came faster than anyone expected. Coalition intelligence had discovered the location of the Alliance's primary command center. They had amassed their largest invasion fleet yet. 3,000 ships converged on human space with the intention of destroying everything the Alliance had built. The government of Earth declared a state of total war. Every available military resource was mobilized. Every civilian who could fight was trained and armed. The destiny of the galaxy would be decided in the coming days. Commander Wells stood in the command center alongside Kira, Thren, and leaders of a dozen other species that had joined the Alliance. Together, they represented billions of lives that depended on their decisions. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. But Commander Wells had learned long ago that leadership meant making difficult choices even when you were terrified. The first coalition ships entered the outer defense perimeter on a clear morning. Within hours, the sky above Earth was filled with alien craft. The explosions began. Cities that had stood for hundreds of years were reduced to rubble in minutes. Thousands died in the opening attacks. The coalition was overwhelming everything with brute force and numbers. Then the three dragons emerged. Cypher, Blaze, and Storm had returned to Earth just days before the invasion. They had been modified since their last mission. New weapons had been installed in their fighters. New defensive systems had been added. They had been trained in new tactics that coordinated with a larger fleet of human and elven pilots. They were no longer individual warriors. They were the spearhead of a combined alliance force. Kira watched from the command center as her dragons took flight. She watched Cypher move with calculated precision, analyzing the coalition formation and finding its weakness. She watched Blaze accelerate to speeds that human instruments had trouble tracking, striking targets that seemed impenetrable. She watched Storm unleash her magical and technological weapons in devastating combinations that left coalition ships burning and falling. But the coalition kept coming. For every enemy ship destroyed, 2 more arrived. The dragon fighters alone could not turn the tide. The alliance was going to lose. If things continued at this rate, human space would be conquered within a week. The alliance would be broken. Everything they had fought for would be lost. That was when Commander Wells made a decision that would change everything. He authorized a new program that had been in development for months. Project Unity. The program would link the consciousness of a human pilot with a dragon fighter in a way that had never been attempted before. The integration would be more complete than anything previously achieved. The pilot and the dragon would become one entity. They would share thoughts and instincts and tactical knowledge simultaneously. They would be able to operate at a level of efficiency that was theoretically possible, but had never been practically tested. The risks were enormous. The pilot could be injured. The dragon could be damaged. The consciousness integration could fail catastrophically, but the alternative was defeat and death. Commander Wells gave the order. Kira brought the news to her dragons personally. Cypher accepted immediately. He had been hoping for this kind of integration. He wanted to be not just a pilot, but a unified consciousness with a human warrior. Blaze was nervous but eager. She wanted to experience what it would be like to be one being with 2 minds operating in perfect synchronization. Storm's response was characteristic. She asked only one question: what would make us stronger? Within hours, 3 of the Alliance's best pilots were selected for the experiment. They entered specialized chambers where the integration process would take place. Kira watched the procedure on monitors. She could see the neural connections forming. She could see the pilots and the dragons becoming linked at a level that went beyond communication. They were merging. Consciousness with consciousness. Mind with mind. Human understanding with dragon instinct. The integration process took 6 hours. By the end, 3 beings emerged from the chambers who were simultaneously human and dragon, individual and unified. One consciousness split between 2 forms. The experience had been simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The pilots described it as being able to think thoughts that were too large for a single brain. The dragons described feeling the burden and the joy of human emotion in a way they had never experienced before. Then they flew. When the 3 unified beings took to the sky, the entire battle changed. A single unified consciousness in a dragon pilot was exponentially more effective than the best coordination between separate beings. Cypher moved with human tactical awareness and dragon physical capabilities. Every move was perfect. Every shot was placed with absolute precision. Blaze moved with human strategy guiding her natural speed. She was not just fast. She was fast in exactly the right ways. Storm became a force of nature. Human determination combined with dragon magical ability created something that the coalition had no defense against. The 3 unified beings tore through the coalition fleet. Their kill ratios exceeded anything previously recorded. Within hours, the tide had completely turned. The coalition fleet, which had seemed overwhelming moments before, began to fragment and scatter. Their ships were destroyed faster than they could replace them. Their tactics proved ineffective against warriors who could think and act at this new level of integration. But the battle was not yet won. Deep in the coalition fleet, the command ship remained. It was the largest vessel, protected by layers of defensive systems and surrounded by the most elite coalition warriors. To win the war, the Alliance would have to destroy the command ship, and to do that, someone would have to fly directly into the heart of the coalition formation. The 3 unified beings looked at each other mentally. They understood what had to be done. Together, they accelerated toward the coalition command ship. The enemy threw everything at them. Fighters swarmed around them. Weapons tore into their armor. The pain was intense, transmitted through both the human and dragon components of their consciousness. But they did not stop. They could not stop. Kira watched from the command center as her dragons flew toward what seemed like certain death. She wanted to scream. She wanted to make them turn back. But she understood that this was the moment. This was what all the training had been for. This was what they were born to do. The three unified beings reached the Coalition command ship. Simultaneously, they launched every weapon at their disposal. Missiles, laser fire, magical energy, ballistic rounds. Everything they had was unleashed in a coordinated strike. The command ship's shields held for a moment. Then they failed. The explosion was visible from Earth. It lit up the sky like a second sun. The largest Coalition vessel was vaporized. With its destruction, the command structure of the invasion force collapsed. The remaining Coalition ships, suddenly without coordination, began to retreat. The Alliance had won, but the cost had been high. When the three unified beings returned to Earth, their ships were badly damaged. The pilots had been injured. The dragons had taken damage that required weeks of recovery. But they had survived. They had done what seemed impossible. They had defeated an invasion that should have been unstoppable. Kira rushed to the hangar as soon as the ships landed. She moved through the military personnel and technicians until she reached her dragons. Cypher could barely lift his head. Blaze was unconscious but still breathing. Storm was awake, her silver eyes meeting Kira's with a look of profound satisfaction and pain. Kira placed her hands on each of them. She spoke without words. She conveyed her love and her pride and her gratitude. She conveyed that they had changed the course of history, that they had proven what was possible when humanity combined with other species, that they had shown the galaxy that unity and cooperation could overcome anything. Over the following weeks, the damage was repaired. The pilots recovered from their injuries. The dragons healed their wounds. The Alliance celebrated their victory, but they also mourned the millions who had died in the conflict. The costs had been enormous, but the galaxy was safe now. For the first time in generations, there was peace. Kira stood once more on the observation deck with her three dragons. The star crystal mask that she had worn when this journey began lay on a table nearby. She no longer needed it. She no longer needed to hide who she was. She was no longer purely elf or purely human or purely anything. She was something new, something that had been created through learning and suffering and love and war. The three dragons stood beside her, each one changed by their experiences. Each one bearing the scars of their battles. Each one carrying the knowledge that they had been born as weapons, but had chosen to be something more. They had chosen to be warriors. They had chosen to be protectors. They had chosen to be part of something larger than themselves. A new era was beginning. An era where species worked together not because they had to, but because they had learned to. An era where what had seemed impossible was proven to be simply waiting for the right combination of courage, intelligence, and determination. An era where an elven woman and her three dragons had shown the entire galaxy what could be achieved through unity and hope.